Yes, I think we shall start. Yes, exactly. Dear colleagues, I'm really very sorry, but we are running a little behind the schedule, and that's why I have to cancel our coffee break, and we have to start our new session. Just thanks to the technological miracle, I would say, I see in Zoom two distinguished colleagues, Peter BOETTKE and Professor Friedman. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our distinguished guests for managing to find time in their pretty busy schedule to participate in our conference. Just mind that on the East Coast now it's 7 a.m. and colleagues woke up at such an early hour to share their thoughts about Adam Smith with us. And the fact that they are here, it's a great honor and privilege for all of us. And if there are no objections, I think Professor BOETTKE will speak first, and as it is written in the conference program, and Professor Friedman will have the floor after Professor BOETTKE. So, yes, thank you, Professor BOETTKE. And probably before Professor BOETTKE will start his presentation, I would like to say just a few words about him. Of course, Professor BOETTKE is well known to Russian scholars. He is a distinguished professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University. For me personally, Professor BOETTKE, I think he's a great, first of all, economic historian who offered a fascinating explanation of the collapse of the Soviet economy, just blending the Mises calculation argument with some Talak's logic of political decision-making. He's also one of the leading figures of the modern Austrian school of economics, I think, and Professor BOETTKE is also one of the most, I think, eminent contemporary specialists in Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek's works. So it's now my great pleasure to give floor to Professor BOETTKE. Please, yes, we see the slides, and you have up to half an hour. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here. It's been a long time since I presented at Moscow State University, so this is exciting for me, the modern technology to be able to do this and return. And I was very thrilled, as much as I could catch from the last talk, the promotion of the work of the School of Salamanca and Marjorie Grice Hutchinson in particular. So to the audience, I just want to reinforce what you just heard from the last speaker about the benefits of revisiting the work of the School of Salamanca. Sort of an interesting story in that is Juan Mariana, who's one of the leaders of the School of Thought, had actually written a book on regicide, the ability to kill the king, and the king actually celebrated Juan Mariana's work. But then Juan Mariana wrote a book about the problems of inflation and how the government was causing inflation and destroying the value of the currency of the people. And the king threw Juan Mariana in jail for that. So we economists have always faced difficult issues. So I have this great honor to talk about Adam Smith. I will try to do so in a time frame to make sure that Professor Friedman has his allotted time as well. So it's Adam Smith's 300th birthday, as you all know. This is why we're here celebrating him. Adam Smith is most well known for the theory of moral sentiments as well as the Wealth of Nations, but he also had planned to write a third volume having to do with jurisprudence and the nature of government. But it was an unfinished work, and Smith had his works burned at his death. And so we don't really have the book on jurisprudence. We have lectures from his classes, but we don't have his full worked out idea. But that was the basic idea, is that you would have morality, economy, and then the state, and be able to examine those things. I think that's important to keep in mind here. This title in my last part of my slide is from an article by Kenneth Boulding, and it's one of the most important articles I ever read in economics, called After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith? And what Boulding did, Boulding's the second John Bates Clark Medal winner, by the way, right after Samuelson. But he's the only of the early John Bates Clark Medal winners not to be honored with the Nobel Prize. And a large part of that is because Boulding was, stood in opposition to much of the way economics had evolved during his lifetime, from the his intellectual lifetime, from the 1940s into the 2000s. Say, he lived into the 90s, but that was it. Anyway, after Samuelson, Who Needs Smith? We all do, because Smith's work still has evolutionary potential for us. This is this notion of the extended present that Boulding builds. And my teacher, Jim Buchanan, used to stress about Adam Smith to all of us. It's those who sit in the seat of Adam Smith that are going to advance the science. And what Buchanan thought about that was the exchange paradigm rather than the allocation paradigm, and political and economic, political and social philosophy, and what Smith has to bring to bear in that. So I would say for all of you today that one of the reasons why we should read Adam Smith today is because of the wisdom that Adam Smith brings us about moral and political philosophy, the insight that Adam Smith brings us about the nature and causes of the wealth of nations and the operation of how the world works, and the guidance, which is how do we see our way through for our great purpose. And this is what Smith lays out as what he calls his liberal plan for liberty, equality, and justice. What's going on here? Okay, so this is sort of the intellectual landscape of modern social science. This is what I call mainline economics. This is economics and what unites the economics from Adam Smith all the way up, say, through to Vernon Smith and the substantive propositions, which I contrast with mainstream economics, which is what is currently scientifically fashionable at the top 5 journals and the top 5 programs that govern so much of our science. And instead, what we want to look at is an empirical strategy and our theoretical strategy. And so the way that I'm trying to argue here is that one of the missing boxes, the highlighted box, is this notion of rational choice institutionalism, which is the kind of program of mainline economics. And way to think about that is that mainline economics derives the invisible hand proposition from the rational choice postulate, but via institutional analysis. Another way to think about that is that our goal as social scientists is to explain the variation in outcomes. And the way we're going to do that is not by explaining it in terms of the people. Good people do good things, bad people do bad things. But instead, we're going to freeze preferences. We're going to vary the institutional environment, and then that's going to explain the variation in the outcomes. And it's that theory which has to examine the institutional details and how they shape the choices and decisions of individuals that is going to be the main focus of our analysis. And so we end up by doing rational choice as if the choosers are human, and institutional analysis as if history matters. And when we do that, what we're going to be able to examine is how it is that individuals within different institutional structures will take their natural propensities, which could be either Smithian in nature or Hobbesian in nature, and how the institutional environment is going to steer us in one direction or the other direction in that regard. So our Hobbesian propensity is to pillage and plunder. Our Smithian propensity is to truck, barter, and exchange. So we can divide the world into either raiding or trading. And the decision for us to raid or trade is going to be a function of the institutional environment within which we find ourselves, which explains the marginal benefits, marginal costs of us going in this direction or that direction. And this is the sort of research program in comparative institutions that we engage in. So, what is the invisible hand? This is actually a kind of a controversial theme in Smith, as you probably know. People, Smith only uses the phrase "the invisible hand" 3 times in his writings, and so that ends up by causing some disturbance with people. So, what did he mean? Did he mean God's orchestration of the social order? I want to say no. That was a trope used by critics to dismiss the claims as metaphysical nonsense. Rhetorical move with only 3 references in his work, History of Astronomy, TMS, and The Wealth of Nations. And I want to say no, while there's no doubt that Smith was very, very conscious of the rhetoric in his writings, there's a counterintuitive nature of his observation. And so he's not being ironic in the use of the term. He actually is trying to identify something, and I want to suggest that what he's trying to identify is a systematic way of thinking about the way the world organizes itself. His teacher, Ferguson, used this phrase of human action, but not of human design. Others have described this as the sum is greater than the whole of its parts. And so again, what you have is you have an animating actor, you have an institutional filter, and that gives rise to the explanation of social cooperation. The thing that we want to explain is social cooperation. The explaining is going to be done by rational choice institutionalism, at least, and that's what I'm trying to argue is the invisible hand. So you see the invisible hand not only in Adam Smith's Butcher, Baker, and Brewer, and as also in the common woolen coat, but you also see it in his contrast over why it is that we don't want to have a state religion. Whereas Hume, his friend, also reasoning in this frame, argued for a state religion because he didn't want religiosity. Hume was a critic of religion. Smith is someone who values religion. And so Smith wanted to have, religiosity emerge. And it's the same logic with the ministers that he used with teachers and the difference between Oxford and Glasgow. The professors in Oxford were paid by an endowment. Therefore, they didn't have the incentive to actually be real teachers. The teachers in Glasgow were paid by student fees. Therefore, they were very engaged with their students. In both instances, they're homo professornomicus, but the institutional environment directs their behavior in one way or another way. And it's that directing which is the invisible hand I want to suggest. Okay, so back to Smith. As I said, the thing to be explained, social cooperation among disparate and distant people. Explanation, rational choice institutionalism. And we see this in the specialization and exchange and the refinements of division of labor. So one of Smith's sort of major first principles, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Another question? Oh. All right. And then, the idea of the expansion of trade and the importance of security of persons and property and how we can overcome the violence trap to be able to develop. By the way, this is a very good example of Smith's extended present. Many of you in the room might know of the work of Doug North and Barry Weingast and John Wallace, was Violence and Social Orders, where they try to explain the origins of development, and they have these doorstep conditions where you go from a natural state until you end up by getting to a more constrained state. Or in the more recent work by Acemoglu and Robinson, what they call the narrow corridor, in which you try to have move from a absence of Leviathan or an unconstrained Leviathan to a shackled Leviathan. This research program about how we overcome the violence trap, well, Barry Weingast has turned all of his attention to Adam Smith, because Adam Smith, in the middle of The Wealth of Nations, has a long discussion about how you can do this. And so Weingast is now working his way through Smith to figure that out and then apply it to today. All right. So one of the things I just wanted to stress here about the common woolen coat. So we have this natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, but we truck, barter, and exchange in a world in which we are getting cooperation and anonymity. So one of the things about the woolen coat, that's an early description passage in The Wealth of Nations. he asks the question, how does the common woolen coat end up on the back of the day labor? And then he walks through the extended chain of the division of labor that would make possible the ability to deliver the common woolen coat. But he also says, right in the passage about the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, that scarce in our lifetime do we have the opportunity to make a few close friends. So therefore, we can't rely on the intimate order to get our dinner, right? We have to instead appeal to their self-interest. And so what Smith is wrestling with is this question of how is it that you live in the company of strangers? How is it that you're able to get cooperation and anonymity? That's sort of the central mystery of economics. Again, how do you get social cooperation in the division of labor when you're coordinating all these individuals that you don't even know? And so what you're going to have to rely on is the power of the incentives and the informational feedback loops that are provided by property, contract, and consent, not by having direct affiliation with people. And this play between Smith's notion of the man in the breast and our empathy with others, and the difference between empathy and sympathy, and the span of our moral sympathy. When we're talking about the Great Society and division of labor, we've reached the edge of the span of our moral sympathy, which means we have to rely not so much on our feelings towards one another and our shared humanity, but instead to our shared notion of self-interest and the benefits of exchange that we can have with one another and whatnot. That's how we get the productive specialization and social cooperation, peaceful social cooperation, to mutually beneficial exchange. All right, so I'm not going to go through this because I'm going to run out of time, but basically what Smith is trying to do in the TMS is develop a moral theory that is not based on God, but instead is based on what works, sort of a pragmatic thing about the way we interact with one another. A current contemporary philosopher, David Schmitz, likes to use the metaphor of the neighborhood. And in his new book called Living Together, it's about how is it that we find rules that allow us to live in the neighborhood together peacefully and prosperously. And so this external force that does this is approbation and disapprobation, and the internal force is our impartial spectator. In Smith's theory, I want to suggest that he's writing before the French Revolution, and so as a result of that, the split between rights and consequences are not as clear as would later come about in the post-French Revolutionary period and Bentham and others that followed from it. And so the idea was that he was basically developing an authentic liberal utilitarianism, and that is rights and consequences in his system go together. And one of the individuals who helped try to make that argument is later on is Herbert Spencer, in which Spencer argued that you could imagine a rule utilitarianism, not an act utilitarianism, but a rule utilitarianism of the philosophical radicals, the British economists that came after Smith. Those utilitarian could mimic the best of deontological liberalism. And so as a result of that, you can get this issue of the organic rise of the system of natural liberty being connected to the law of progress. And I think that's one of the major things that we need to examine in comparative institutions, is diving deep into not only how liberalism works, like Deirdre McCloskey is asking us to do, but also what is the actual institutional makeup of the liberal society, which is in many ways what people like Jim Buchanan was trying to do, what Hayek was trying to do in the Constitution of Liberty, and today what people like Acemoglu and others are trying to dig into to understand how is it that you move from a absence of Leviathan to a constrained Leviathan, constitutional government. How do you go from being Somalia to being Denmark? How would that actual transition take place? One of the things that's important in the Smithian program, and these are my last few slides, and related to the title of my talk, which is on the issue of human sociability, and that is the fruits of social cooperation our feelings of friendship towards one another, our ability to have effective compassion and whatnot with one another, is a function of the fact that we can escape the Malthusian trap, which means that we escape the Hobbesian propensities. So by finding an institutional pattern which moves us from the Hobbesian propensities to the Smithian propensities, so rather than pillage and plunder, we engage in truck barter and exchange. What that's going to allow us to do from the productivity of that, because we've engaged in productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation, we're going to be able to develop these fellow feelings, these deep friendships, all of these other things that go on in the market that are the fruits of social cooperation and are some of the greatest parts of our existence. Mm-hmm. If we didn't have that rise of that productivity, we would end up actually being in a war of all against all, and we would break down those kind of things. And then we would appeal to our Hobbesian propensities once again. But there's a problem with realizing this benefits of this great social cooperation and anonymity, is that it requires us to have moral systems that are at odds with our moral intuitions. So our moral intuitions rose from a world of small bands. This is Hayek's thesis, from a world of small bands in which we were protecting one another in our band from the violence of the other bands. And that's how our moral intuitions evolved. But the moral demands of the great society are at odds with that. And so what Hayek argued is that we need to learn in modern society how to live in two worlds at once, right? Because if we allowed the extended order into our intimate orders, we would crush them. On the same time, if we try to expand our intimate order to our extended order, we'll crush our ability to generate sort of a peace and prosperity, right? Or as Smith moves it, move from the lowest forms of barbarism to the highest forms of opulence. We're not going to be able to do that. So it's this tension between our moral intuitions and the moral demands of the great society is going to be one of the main questions that Smith forces us to think about. Again, the way to put it here would be, how do you square the arguments in the theory of moral sentiments with the arguments in the Wealth of Nations? Rather than seeing them in the Das Adam Smith problem, the question is, how do you square them so that the potential problem, which is what the Germans thought there was, disappears, and instead you see the two faces of Adam Smith, as my former colleague Vernon Smith likes to stress. So just some final points. These are two books that have come out recently that grapple with this final problem. One of them is by Sam Fleischacker. It's a book that these both came out during COVID. One of them is this book, and it's about the difference between Smith and Hume on the issue of empathy and sympathy, and the notion of having whether or not our feelings for others are a project of proximity. We only can feel for others when we are close to their situation, or the more mature situation, which is projection. So we could imagine ourselves in another shoe. And so, and what was the morality of that once we be able to do that? And what Nussbaum argues in her book, in contrast, is that Smith, the cosmopolitan ideal of Smith, the idea that we are citizens of the world, that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, grow the market, you're going to expand the division of labor, and so you have this sort of global marketplace of ideas and of products and services. And what her argument is that this is a noble but flawed ideal, because in Smith's rendering, it would require us to take on too stoic of a stance in respect to some aspects of human suffering. And so I interpret this as, again, the Hayek tension between that our moral demands require us to hold positions which our moral intuitions often find repugnant. And in that tension, our moral intuitions are going to win out over our moral demands, but in the process of doing that, we destroy the possibility of the very progress that makes possible improvements in the human condition. And so we have to really, come to final grips with that. And the final thing I'll say, so I'm coming to the end here, is that I just want to repeat what I said in the beginning. Why read Adam Smith today? I think we continue to read Adam Smith today because we can get wisdom from Adam Smith by reading his moral and political philosophical reflections. I think we can get insight from Adam Smith. That is our scientific understanding of how the world works, how the market economy is animated by exchange, how the institutions of property, contract, and consent frame our our economic and commercial life, and what are the consequences of the wealth and poverty of nations for the way that we engage in human interaction with each other. So scientific insights, and then finally guidance again. Smith tells us about the liberal plan of liberty, equality, and justice, how we develop and advance that liberal plan. He gives us a sort of guidance of that I think is as relevant or more relevant for the world that we live in today than the world that Smith inherited in the 18th century. So I apologize for the speed at which I went through that, but I hope that people have gotten something out of my talk, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor BOETTKE. Yes, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Probably I will start with some questions. Yes, and I have the first question. The question is the following. I really like your thought-provoking article, The Evolution of Economics, written together with Peter Leeson and Daniel Smith. And in this article, you used a very interesting analogy, a sand glass, in order to explain the evolution of economics from Adam Smith to the present day. And the analogy tells us that at the time of Adam Smith, who was at the top of the sand glass, economics was a wide discipline, and it addresses the big questions like why some nations are rich while others are poor. At the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the narrowing of economics discipline accelerated, and since the 1990s, we have seen some sort of transformation, yes, of the discipline, and we again turn to Adam Smith's big questions. But do you think that Smith's big questions will survive the continuing empirical turn, or, as some scholars say, the theoretical turn? Yes, this is the first question, and the second one is it deals with your mainline economics concept. Can we call it as a middle way between mainstream economics, which is often defined in sociological terms as something fashionable among the top economists, and heterodox economics, often fixated on critics of capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. They're excellent, I think. And so let me just try to. I actually think the answer to both of them, there's a combination of that that I'll explain. So I take the question at the end, not so of the first question, not so much for me to repeat the argument in the article, which basically just says is that economics became a mathematical science and became transformed from political economy to economics. We ended up by asking and answering more precisely narrower and narrower questions. We tried to transform economics into a form of social physics. And in doing that and having the notions of the control, that economics was a science of control, that was different from economics as a science of understanding. In Adam Smith, he didn't try to orchestrate, the common woolen coat. that already was an existing phenomena, and he was trying to philosophically reflect on it, which is different from the idea of the tool of economics to maintain full employment in your economy, or to, you know, manage business cycles or things like that. But anyway, what happened was economics became narrower and narrower, and we found out that we could answer very, very precisely less and less. And so what happened, and unfortunately for your country, you know, the experience in your country was actually one of the telling things that opened the world back up again, which was the failure of the efforts at central planning and the consequences of that for economic and political and social life. And that, you know, threw a very serious challenge to economics. And one of the things that's so important to understand is the evolution of the techniques that were used to try to succeed at planning. All right. So it's not like, you know, they did, you know, linear programming in 1918 or whatever, right? You know, you have Bukharin and Preobrazhensky are writing the ABCs of communism. It's a different kind of idea. Then, you know, you have, you know, an alternative approach, which tries to manage the market and use that. Then you have sort of the idea of the 5-year plans. And you constantly are having ways in which we're trying to come up with new and better ways to sort of succeed in planning. And as that was going on in the Soviet Union, you also have in the United States the same kind of ideas. So, you know, Koncharovich is developing his approach, but that's also being approached over here in the United States with the Coles Commission and all kinds of other people. So we have planometrics, we have Leontief input-output tables, we have, you know, material balances approach to planning, all of that. And the result is that it didn't generate sort of the outcomes. And what was missing in all of that was institutions. All right, so institutions had gotten squeezed out of economics. Whereas to Hume, right, the foundation in the Treatise of Human Nature, the foundation of our ability to realize productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation is what he says: property, contract, and consent. You had to have stability of possession, the transference by consent, and the keeping of promises. As we economists like to say, imagine a world in which you don't have stability of possession, you don't have transference by consent, and you don't have keeping of promises. Now solve for the equilibrium, right? So, all right, so that's the kind of outcome, but we lost sight of that. And, you know, just as a quick aside for those of you, you know, if you think about the counter-revolution to Keynesian or the Samuelsonian sort of neoclassical synthesis, we tend to think of it always in terms of Milton Friedman and monetarism. But there also was a whole microeconomics chain. There was the development of law and economics, there's development of property rights economics, development of public choice economics, and the development of market process economics and entrepreneurship. And those four things all evolve, which require attention not only to the animating actor and the decision maker, so you can't have the aggregation that the other types are doing, but also the institutional environment within which people are behaving. And so entrepreneurship, for example, can be directed in productive ways, in evasive ways, in unproductive ways, depending on the institutional environment. And we started to pay attention to all of those kind of questions as communism was revealing all of its difficulties in operation. Also, as an aside, development planning efforts were crashing and burning at this time as well. And one of the other things that everyone forgets is that the Nordic countries were all dealing with a fiscal cliff in the 1990s, and they all had to actually adjust and reform as well. So that meant that economics now was going to open up again to institutions. And so we end the 19th century with Max Weber asking, why no capitalism in China? And we end the 20th century with Acemoglu and Robinson asking, why do nations fail? Right? And so it's the same kind of question. Now, your other question, which is vitally connected to that, is can these big questions survive the empirical turn in economics? And I would point to a very nice article by Acemoglu, which is responding to Duflo, and where Acemoglu argues that you need to have equilibrium, political economy, and basically welfare economics to be able to do the judgments that even Duflo wants to do with the randomized controlled trials. But I would say that, whoever asked the question is onto something very big, because it's Duflo is the one who has the big research program, right? So she's the one who has the JPAL and has all the people all over the world running around doing things. Acemoglu is a famous economist. Schleifer's a famous economist. But those kind of questions that they ask are basically reserved for them, right? Rather than young people. You wouldn't tell a young person, unless they were at George Mason, oh, do a dissertation on this kind of stuff. They would instead learn to write a dissertation on a much more narrow empirical topic. It used to be, find another, sort of approach to causal inference, now, so find some instrument and go from there. Now I think you might see other techniques like synthetic controls or some other thing, but the discipline is an empirical discipline rather than a theory discipline. And part of that is because the methodology of economics is still the dominant methodology when economics was narrow. So you tried to fit big questions into a narrow straitjacket, and so the only way you could operationalize the big questions was to try to treat institutions as like another thing that you put into a regression and tried to figure that out. And so this is what McCloskey is agitating against in her Bettering Humanomics. It's also what Weingast is arguing when he criticizes what he calls the neoclassical institutional disease, which is that we mention institutions, but we don't analyze institutions. And so to me, I think that, what I've learned is that I think that we have to open ourselves up again and keep agitating for it. What Kenneth Boulding, in his review of Samuelson's Foundations in the JPE, argued was the literary borderland between economics and sociology, because we have to recognize that our commercial lives are always embedded within the law, within politics, within society. And so we have to open ourselves up to studying that. And that brings me to mainline economics, which I will, I'll say very, very quickly, or try to. And I think that putting it as a middle ground between mainstream economics and heterodox economics is actually pretty accurate. And the way I would describe that is that the mainline economists begin with a heterodox problem situation. So individuals are imperfect individuals existing in a world of deep uncertainty, okay? But they have a mainstream conclusion, which is that individuals interacting in that world, despite their imperfections and whatnot, can stumble their way towards social cooperation under the division of labor and the welfare properties of an equilibrating economy. And so, but where the analytical thrust is on the institutions and the comparative institutions within which these imperfect individuals. And so that leads us to focus on what I've called epistemic institutionalism, which is rather than incentive institutionalism, we also have to have with it epistemic institutionalism, which is how is it that we imperfect agents learn through feedback and signals to direct our behavior so that we can realize productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation. And it's that institutional pattern in the comparative institutions that I think we're trying to look at in the common ground between, say, Adam Smith, Alfred Marshall, right, Frank Knight, F.A. Hayek, Jim Buchanan, Vernon Smith. And let me just end with Vernon Smith, because I think it pays to look at Smith's, especially look at his Nobel Prize address, where what he calls it, he contrasts constructivist versus ecological rationality. And just by the term ecological rationality, that should alert you to like what he's up to in this. And so it's not behavioral economics. It's not where you're deviating from the rational choice theorems and therefore you identify them as biases or things like that. It's that individuals are omnipresent, are constantly rational, but the manifestations of their rationality is going to be institutionally contextual. And so way I can maybe learn about that is through experiments. And I can show how experimental outcomes are so sensitive to changes in the rules of the game that the players are going to play. So anyway, I appreciate the questions, and I hope
you.
they provided some of an
Thank you.
answer.
Thank you very much, Professor BOETTKE. Thank you for your detailed answers.